Japan, a nation that somehow manages to be both timeless and ever-changing, as though it has been quietly sipping green tea while reinventing itself for 2,000 years. It is the land of the samurai and the salaryman, of Shinto shrines and bullet trains, of Zen gardens where nothing moves for centuries, and pachinko parlors where everything rattles at once. But before we get to shoguns and Sony, we begin with something older, the islands themselves. Japan sits on the restless edge of the Pacific Ring of Fire, a chain of volcanoes that can, at any moment, remind its inhabitants who's really in charge. Mountains dominate the landscape, forests blanket much of it, and flat farmland is scarce. Nature in Japan has always been less a backdrop than a character, sometimes generous, sometimes catastrophic, always present. The earliest people left their mark tens of thousands of years ago in the Paleolithic. Later came the Jōmon, whose pottery is among the oldest in the world. They were hunter-gatherers who fished the seas, gathered nuts, and carved rope-like patterns into clay. Their lives were simple, but not without beauty. Archaeologists find strange figurines, dogu, with big staring eyes, as if the Jōmon had already sensed the gods were watching. Then came the Yayoi, bringing rice cultivation from the mainland. Rice is no mere crop in Japan. It is culture, economy, and spirituality rolled into one grain. Growing rice meant cooperation, irrigation, rituals to the gods for rain. From this, villages grew, and from villages, chiefdoms. By the early centuries CE, Japan had its first great ruler, the Yamato clan, whose descendants, remarkably, still sit on the chrysanthemum throne. Japan's imperial line claims to be the oldest continuous monarchy in the world. Unlike most royal houses, which end up overthrown, exiled, or embarrassingly caught in revolutions, the Japanese emperors kept going. Sometimes as rulers, sometimes as figureheads, but always there. Religion, too, gave Japan its unique character. Shinto, the way of the gods, worship not one almighty being, but a vast company of spirits, or kami, who lived in rivers, trees, mountains, and occasionally in mirrors. It gave Japan a reverence for nature that still lingers today. The bow before a shrine, the cherry blossom festivals that celebrate beauty in fleeting bloom. Later, Buddhism arrived from China, mingling with Shinto in ways that were sometimes harmonious, sometimes awkward, but never quite cancelling each other out. From this foundation, Japan began its long dance of change and continuity. Samurai would rise, shoguns would rule, foreigners would be both welcomed and repelled, and an island nation would make itself both fortress and empire. Sometimes it looked inward, shutting its gates to the outside world. At other times it reached outward, sending fleets, monks, traders, and eventually armies. And yet, through it all, Japan remained recognizably itself, a place of discipline and artistry, of ritual and reinvention, where a sword could be forged with such perfection it was almost a prayer, and where, centuries later, a car engine might be built with the same meticulous care. So tonight, as you close your eyes, we will walk slowly through the history of Japan, from the first potters of the Jōmon to the shoguns of Edo, from the devastation of war to the hum of neon Tokyo. A history told not as a march of battles, but as a long unfolding, calm, rhythmic, like the waves that forever lap Japan's shores. If you were to travel back to Japan before the samurai, before the shoguns, even before the emperors claimed descent from the gods, you wouldn't recognize the place. Not the neon skylines of Tokyo, not the meticulous gardens of Kyoto, not even the rice paddies that today still quilt the countryside. Instead, you'd find islands that were wilder, forested, and eerily quiet. Except, of course, when the earth itself decided to rumble. Japan sits like a precarious dinner plate balanced on the edge of the Pacific Ring of Fire, a fact its inhabitants have never been allowed to forget. Volcanoes smoulder, earthquakes shake teacups off shelves, tsunamis sweep across coastlines. Nature in Japan has always been bossy, always slightly tyrannical. And yet, here's the paradox, that same nature gave beauty in abundance. Clear rivers teeming with fish, forests rich with boar, seas supplying shellfish and seaweed. A hard place to live, but a good place too. The earliest humans shuffled into these islands tens of thousands of years ago, back when land bridges still linked Japan to the Asian mainland. They left stone tools behind, chipped blades and arrowheads, practical, unsentimental stuff. But around 14,000 BCE, something shifted. A people we call the Jōmon emerged, and with them something resembling style. Now, most prehistoric cultures were practical sorts. You made a pot to cook, you made a pot to store, and that was that. Not the Jōmon. They looked at a lump of clay and thought, yes, I'll make this practical, but also, why not jazz it up with some flaming swirls and ropey patterns? Their pottery is some of the oldest in the world, and it's exuberant. Spirals, ridges, almost sculptural forms. Archaeologists dig them up and blink as though they've been tricked. Surely this is modern art. No, it's 10,000 years old and somebody made it to cook a stew. The Jōmon also gave us the mysterious dogu. These are little clay figurines, bug-eyed, with strange bodies and elaborate patterns carved into their tiny frames. Were they gods? Charms? Something to frighten off bad spirits? No one is entirely sure. But stand in front of one in a museum and you get the sense they were important. They gaze back at you, unblinking, as if saying, "We knew things you will never know." Rather spooky, really. Life for the Jōmon was not easy, but it wasn't drudgery either. They fished the seas, hunted deer and boar in the forests, and gathered acorns and chestnuts. They lived in pit dwellings, homes dug into the earth, roofed with wood and thatch, which sounds terribly rustic, but also rather cosy in winter. Imagine sitting around a fire, one of those dogu perched nearby, while outside snow fell silently on the pines. There are worse ways to pass an evening. But history is never still. Around 300 BCE, a new people arrived, the Yayoi, bringing with them rice cultivation from Korea and China. And rice in Japan was not just another crop. Rice was destiny. Unlike hunting or gathering, rice demanded communities to cooperate. You couldn't flood and drain a paddy field on your own. You needed irrigation systems, canals, shared schedules, rituals for planting and harvest. Rice tethered people to the land, and from that tethering came villages, from villages came hierarchies, and from hierarchies came politics. The Yayoi also brought new technologies. Bronze bells called dotaku, which may have been used in ceremonies to pray for good harvests, and iron weapons which, predictably, were soon put to use not only in farming, but also in fighting. One suspects the Jōmon, still clinging to their acorns and swirly pots, found the arrival of these rice-growing newcomers somewhat inconvenient. But, as history tends to go, the farmers outlasted the foragers. Slowly, the Yayoi way of life spread, reshaping the islands. And so Japan began to organize itself. Villages became chiefdoms. Chiefdoms grew into alliances. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, a new power emerged, the Yamato clan. They were ambitious, practical, and above all, political geniuses. They didn't just claim to be leaders, they claimed to be descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. It was, if you think about it, the ultimate power move. Don't argue with me, I'm literally divine. And remarkably, people accepted it. Thus was born the chrysanthemum throne, the oldest continuous monarchy in the world. We know the Yamato were serious about their status because they built tombs, colossal earthen mounds called kofun, in which they buried their leaders with mirrors, swords, and regalia. Some of these tombs stretch longer than football fields, shaped like keyholes visible even from the air. They remain today, grassy mounds dotted across the landscape, silent reminders that Japan's rulers were already playing the game of grandeur long before Versailles or Buckingham Palace. Religion, too, gave Japan its unique flavor. Shinto, the indigenous belief system, was less about commandments and more about relationships with spirits called kami. Every mountain, river, tree, and waterfall could have a spirit. You didn't worship one god. You acknowledged countless presences all around you. A particularly shiny rock might be a kami. A particularly old tree, definitely a kami. This made the landscape itself sacred, and it bred a reverence for nature that still echoes today in Japan's gardens, festivals, and even in its poetry. Then came Buddhism, drifting in from China and Korea like a monk with a suitcase of sutras. Unlike Shinto, Buddhism came with elaborate doctrines and promises of enlightenment. The two might have clashed, but instead they coexisted. A villager could pray to a Shinto shrine in the morning for rain, and to a Buddha in the evening for salvation. Pragmatism at its finest. Rather like hedging your bets. If one god didn't hear you, perhaps another would. By the 5th and 6th centuries, Japan was consciously borrowing from its continental neighbors. Writing, in the form of Chinese characters, was adopted. Confucian ideas of hierarchy and order seeped in, providing convenient justification for why peasants should listen to nobles, and nobles to emperors. But Japan never became China's vassal. They admired, they borrowed, but they always made things distinctly Japanese. And so, by the time Europe was stumbling through its dark ages, Japan already had its cultural foundations in place. Rice as the staple, the emperor as the divine monarch, Shinto as the native faith, Buddhism as the philosophical overlay. These elements, once fused, would endure every upheaval, civil wars, foreign invasions, even modernization itself. What's striking is how much continuity there was. The imperial line founded in the Yamato period, still there. The reverence for rice, still there. The blending of Shinto and Buddhism, still there, even if the balance shifted over time. For a culture perched precariously on volcanic islands, Japan managed a surprising consistency. If you were a Yayoi farmer, standing ankle-deep in a muddy paddy, or a Jōmon potter, scratching swirls into clay, you would not have guessed you were laying the foundations for one of the world's most distinctive civilizations. But you were. And centuries later, when samurai carried swords forged as beautifully as Jōmon pots, when emperors sat in palaces still claiming descent from the sun, when modern Japanese still gathered under cherry blossoms to admire fleeting beauty, it was these prehistoric beginnings that whispered beneath it all. If Chapter 1 was all mud, rice and myth, farmers in paddies, dogu staring with bulging eyes, emperors claiming they were the sun's grandchildren. Chapter 2 brings a dramatic change of scene. Suddenly, Japan acquires capitals, palaces, courtiers in layered robes, and bureaucrats who seem more interested in their calligraphy than their swords. In short, Japan becomes civilized, or at least it pretends to. The story begins in 710 CE, when the imperial court decided it was time to stop wandering about and settle down properly. Until then, the Japanese capital had been something of a moving target. Whenever an emperor died, the court would pack up its lacquered furniture and move on, thanks to an awkward Shinto belief that death was polluting. Practical perhaps, but exhausting. Imagine being a civil servant who's just arranged his scrolls when, oh no, the emperor's popped off. Time to move the whole palace again. So, in 710, they founded a permanent capital, Heijōkyō, better known as Nara. And they didn't invent it from scratch. They had seen the great Chinese Tang dynasty capital at Chang'an and thought, we'll have one of those, thank you very much. So they laid out Nara on a Chinese-style grid, with straight avenues, gates, and a palace to dominate the north. Copycat perhaps, but impressive nonetheless. Nara was also when Buddhism truly settled into Japan. Monks from China and Korea had been arriving with sutras, statues, and a flair for ritual. The Japanese court, always eager for a bit of imported grandeur, embraced it. Temples sprouted, most famously the Todaiji, with its colossal bronze Buddha, so large that to cast it, they nearly bankrupted the nation's supply of copper. The Buddha, calm and majestic, sat in his great hall, while deer roamed freely around the temple precincts, as they still do today, somewhat less, majestically when they steal tourists' biscuits. But Buddhism came with baggage. Temples gained land, wealth, and influence. Monks became political players. Emperors, who had hoped Buddhism would lend them cosmic legitimacy, soon realized it also gave them troublesome rivals. In fact, the entanglement became so awkward that the court eventually decided to pack up again and move, this time to get away from over-mighty monks. Thus, in 794 CE, a new capital was founded, Heian-kyo, today's Kyoto. Heian means peace and tranquility, which is charming, though the peace was often more aspiration than reality. Still, Heian became the beating heart of Japanese civilization for centuries. If Nara was about importing Chinese culture wholesale, Heian was about digesting it, softening it, and producing something uniquely Japanese. Life at the Heian court was a curious mixture of elegance and absurdity. Aristocrats floated about in robes of 12 layers, spending their days composing poetry, arranging incense competitions, and agonizing over the precise shade of their sleeves. To be stylish in Heian Japan was not simply to dress well, but to master the art of taste, what the Japanese call miyabi. The court was obsessed with refinement. Men courted women by the quality of their poems. A badly chosen metaphor could end your romantic career. Imagine Tinder, but in 31-syllable verse. This was also the golden age of Japanese literature. Most famously, a lady-in-waiting named Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji, often called the world's first novel. It tells the story of the shining prince, Genji, a man so dazzling that women swooned at his presence, and not a few regretted it later. It is a tale of romance, intrigue, melancholy, and fleeting beauty, quintessentially Japanese in its sensitivity to the sadness of things passing. Reading it today requires patience. It makes War and Peace look like a pamphlet. but it remains a masterpiece of subtlety. Alongside Murasaki was Sei Shonagon, who wrote The Pillow Book. Not quite a novel, more a collection of witty observations, lists, and diary notes. She delighted in cataloguing things that make the heart beat faster, or things that should be large, with an acerbic humour that still feels startlingly modern. She was, in other words, the world's first lifestyle blogger. Beneath the refinement, however, cracks widened. The Heian court grew detached from the provinces, where real power was shifting into the hands of local warriors and landholders. The court may have been debating the perfect curve of a fan, but out in the countryside, armed clans were rising. Taxes failed to reach the capital, estates slipped into private hands, and the emperor became increasingly a ceremonial figure. The real power brokers were families like the Fujiwara clan, who dominated politics by marrying daughters into the imperial line and then ruling through child emperors. It was less throne, more puppet theatre. Still, the Heian period produced a distinctive Japanese identity. Architecture shifted from Chinese-style grandeur to lighter wooden mansions, with sliding screens and verandas opening to gardens. Religion became a blend. Shinto shrines nestled alongside Buddhist temples, each borrowing from the other. Art flourished, with painted scrolls, emaki, illustrating tales in vivid colours. And everywhere an aesthetic of impermanence, the cherry blossom admired precisely because it fell so soon. By the 12th century, though, the court's weakness was undeniable. Provincial warriors, the samurai, were growing in strength. They were rougher than the perfume-drenched courtiers of Kyoto, but far more effective with a bow. Soon, two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, would turn their ambitions on the capital. The elegant Heian world of poetry and incense was about to collide with men on horseback, banners snapping in the wind, arrows flying. But before that storm, we should pause and picture Heian Japan at its height. A court lady in robes trailing behind her, dabbing ink on paper by lamplight. A temple bell tolling in the mist. A cherry blossom petal drifting onto a lacquer tray. It was exquisite, fragile, and already doomed. The Heian period, as we saw, was a world of elegance and ink, of court ladies writing novels and courtiers fretting about sleeve colours. But as the 12th century wore on, a new type of man began to loom large in Japan. He smelled less of incense and more of horse sweat. His poetry, if he bothered at all, was written in the clumsy strokes of someone who had spent more time sharpening blades than brushes. His hands were calloused not from handling scrolls, but from drawing bows. These were the samurai, and their arrival signalled a profound transformation in Japanese history. The word samurai comes from the verb saburao, to serve, and at first that's exactly what they did. They served the aristocratic families of Kyoto, acting as their armed retainers. The provinces were growing unruly, banditry flourished, and tax collection was less reliable than ever. The court in Heian-kyo needed muscle. Enter the mounted warriors, provincial men who could enforce land rights with a sword stroke, defend rice shipments with arrows, and generally scare the wits out of anyone who thought of challenging their masters. But these hired swords didn't remain humble servants for long. Over generations, they became their own class, proud of their martial skills and increasingly disdainful of the silken courtiers. Where a Fujiwara noble might spend weeks agonizing over the exact poetic metaphor for dew on a chrysanthemum, a samurai might simply lop the flower off and see how quickly it bled. two cultures, one delicate, one blunt, and both destined to clash. By the 12th century, two warrior clans towered above the rest, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry would shape the future of Japan. The Taira, led by Taira no Kiyomori, had risen to astonishing heights. Kiyomori was a man of immense ambition and not a little arrogance. He married his daughters into the imperial family, controlled court appointments, and even managed to place his grandson on the throne. It was as if the courtiers had been ousted by their own bodyguards. Aristocrats, accustomed to gentle poetry readings, now found themselves bowing before a gruff warrior with the manners of a stable hand but the power of a kingmaker. Yet power breeds enemies. The Minamoto clan, long resentful of Taira dominance, rallied in opposition. In 1180, a dispute over succession to the throne provided the spark. The result was the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, one of the most famous conflicts in Japanese history. It was a war of banners and charges, of naval battles and sieges, of loyalty and betrayal. It has been romanticized endlessly in epic tales and ballads, the Japanese equivalent of the Iliad. The Genpei War was not merely a contest of arms, it was also a theatre of symbols. Banners fluttered in clan colours, the Taira with their red, the Minamoto with their white. Archers on horseback galloped across battlefields, their arrows whistling as they loosed shots mid-stride. Warriors prized duels, meeting one another in single combat while announcing their names and ancestry in loud voices. This was not war as we imagine it, anonymous industrial slaughter, but war as performance, where honour mattered as what with victory. One of the most celebrated episodes came at the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani in 1184, where Minamoto warriors charged down a near-vertical cliff to surprise the Taira camped below. It should have been suicidal, but it worked. Chaos erupted, and the Taira were routed. Then there was the tragic figure of Atsumori, a young Taira noble cut down by the Minamoto warrior Kumagai Naozane. According to the tale, Kumagai, upon seeing the boy's delicate face and realizing he was younger than his own son, wept even as he delivered the fatal blow. The story became a staple of later No theatre, a meditation not on glory, but on the sorrow of war. The war climaxed at the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, a great naval clash in the narrow straits of Shimonoseki. The Minamoto fleet, led by Minamoto no Yoshitsune, one of Japan's most brilliant if ill-fated generals, outmaneuvered the Taira. Arrows darkened the sky, ships grappled, men fell into the sea. As defeat loomed, the child Emperor Antoku, only 6 years old and a pawl of the Taira, was taken in his grandmother's arms and drowned in the waves, rather than fall into enemy hands. The Taira, once so proud, vanished beneath the water. It was a moment seared into Japanese memory, the end of one clan, the rise of another. The victory gave the Minamoto supremacy, but it also brought them problems. Minamoto no Yoritomo, elder brother of the dashing Yoshitsune, was not the sort to share power. Suspicious of his younger sibling's popularity, Yoritomo eventually turned against him. Yoshitsune, despite his brilliance on the battlefield, was hunted down and forced to commit suicide. A grim reminder that in samurai politics, talent was rarely as important as loyalty. In 1192, Yoritomo achieved something new. He received the title of shogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo from the emperor. The emperor remained on the throne, resplendent and divine, but the shogun held the real power. Thus was born the Kamakura Shogunate, the first military government in Japanese history. Now, what did this mean in practice? Japan for the next 7 centuries would be ruled not by emperors, but by warriors. The emperor would sit in Kyoto writing poems, presiding over rituals, occasionally composing a wistful reflection about cherry blossoms. But the real authority lay with the shogun and his samurai government in Kamakura. It was in effect a polite fiction. The emperor reigned, but the shogun ruled. The Kamakura regime established a new system of land distribution. Samurai were granted estates in return for loyalty and military service. In effect, Japan became a feudal society, much like medieval Europe, with lords, vassals, and peasants bound together by land, loyalty, and violence. Samurai culture began to crystallize: a code of honor, fierce loyalty to one's lord, and an acceptance that death in battle was preferable to dishonor. Later centuries would call it Bushido, the way of the warrior, though in this early period it was less a written code than an instinctive ethic. Life under the Kamakura shogunate was not all warfare. Buddhism continued to evolve, with new sects like Zen arriving from China. Zen monks, with their austere gardens and cryptic koans, appealed to samurai sensibilities. After all, what better way to prepare for death than meditating on the sound of one hand clapping? Meanwhile, trade with China expanded, bringing new goods and ideas, and in Kamakura itself, great temples like Engakuji and Kenchoji were founded, blending warrior patronage with spiritual ambition. Yet beneath the surface tensions lurked. The Minamoto line did not last long, and power soon shifted to the Hojo clan, who served as regents to child shoguns. This delicate arrangement, emperors in Kyoto, shoguns in Kamakura, regents controlling shoguns, was as messy as it sounds. But for all its complications, the Kamakura system endured for over a century. The samurai had arrived, and they were not going away. The courtiers of Heian had once believed refinement and poetry were the pinnacles of civilization. The samurai believed otherwise. To them the world was simple: loyalty, courage, death. It was a harsher creed, but one that would define Japan for centuries. And yet, like all new powers, the Kamakura shogunate would face its great test. Beyond the seas, a new empire was rising, the Mongols, and their eyes had begun to turn towards Japan. But that, as they say, is a story for the next chapter. The Kamakura shogunate had settled itself into power by the early 13th century. The Minamoto had been swept away. The Hojo clan were firmly in charge as regents, and samurai rule seemed secure. Japan's new political order was built on loyalty, land, and the sharp edge of the sword. But history, in its mischievous way, is never content to let a nation rest in its rice fields. Across the sea, a storm was gathering, and not the meteorological kind, though, as it happened, that would play a role too. The storm's name was Mongol. In the early 1200s, a horse-riding people from the steppes of Central Asia had exploded outwards in every direction, conquering empires as if they were knocking over pins in a bowling alley. By the mid-13th century, they controlled lands from the gates of Vienna to the China Sea. Their empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and at its centre was Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, who had not only conquered China, but also installed himself as emperor of the Yuan dynasty. From his court in Beijing, Kublai looked eastward. There, beyond the waves, lay Japan. Small, certainly, compared to China's vastness, but annoyingly independent. Kublai, like all Khans, was not fond of neighbours who declined to acknowledge his supremacy. In 1266, he sent letters to Japan's shogunate demanding tribute and submission. The Japanese response? Polite silence. In diplomacy, that counts as a slap in the face. So Kublai sent an army. In 1274, Mongol ships, packed with some 30,000 men, including Chinese and Korean conscripts, crossed the sea and landed on the shores of Kyushu. The samurai who rushed to meet them were in for a shock. They were used to Japanese warfare, duels of honor, formal declarations, individual archery contests. The Mongols, by contrast, fought with coordinated tactics, drums beating, ranks advancing, volleys of arrows, and thunderous explosions from early gunpowder weapons. Imagine a fencer expecting a duel of skill, suddenly rugby tackled by an entire scrum. The samurai fought bravely, but the Mongols pressed hard. Then, as night fell, fortune intervened. A storm swept in, damaging Mongol ships and forcing a retreat. The Japanese, stunned but relieved, claimed divine favor. Kublai was not the sort to give up after one bad night. In 1281, he launched a second invasion, even larger, with perhaps 140,000 troops and thousands of ships, the biggest seaborne force the world had yet seen. This time, the Japanese were ready. Fortifications had been built along the coast, and samurai poured in to resist. For weeks, fighting raged, and then, once again, nature struck. A colossal typhoon roared in, smashing the Mongol fleet to splinters. Tens of thousands drowned. The survivors limped home. The Japanese called it the kamikaze, the divine wind. In centuries to come, that phrase would take on darker associations, but in the 13th century it was a triumph, proof, many believed, that the gods themselves protected Japan. The Mongols never tried again, but victory came at a cost. Defending against the invasions had been ruinously expensive. Fortifications don't build themselves, after all. The samurai who fought so valiantly expected rewards, as was the custom, but there was no conquered territory to hand out, no spoils of war. Instead, there was debt. The Kamakura shogunate grew strained, and discontent simmered. A grateful nation, yes, but an indebted government, dangerously so. By the early 14th century, tensions between the imperial court and the shogunate were also growing. The emperors, though largely ceremonial, had never fully accepted their reduced role. Emperor Go-Daigo, in particular, was determined to claw back power. In 1331, he launched a rebellion. At first it failed and he was exiled, but rebellions are like mold. They grow back. With support from ambitious samurai, notably Ashikaga Takauji, Go-Daigo returned, toppled the Kamakura regime, and declared the Kenmu Restoration. For a brief moment, it looked as if the emperors might rule again. Go-Daigo marched into Kyoto, sat himself on the throne, and dreamed of restoring imperial authority. But dreams and politics rarely mix. He alienated powerful samurai with his high-handedness, rewarding court favourites instead of warriors, and his supposed ally, Ashikaga Takauji, soon decided he preferred to be in charge himself. By 1336, Takauji had turned against the emperor, marched on Kyoto, and established a new military regime. the Ashikaga Shogunate, also known as the Muromachi Shogunate, after its Kyoto district. Go-Daigo fled south, setting up a southern court in exile. For decades, Japan had two rival imperial courts, northern, backed by the shoguns, and southern, claiming legitimacy. It was a rather awkward arrangement, though admittedly handy for schoolchildren who enjoy confusing history teachers with questions like, which emperor was the real one? The Ashikaga shogunate was weaker than the Kamakura had been. Instead of a firm grip from a coastal stronghold, power now rested uneasily in Kyoto, where the shogun had to balance fractious samurai lords. Central authority was thin. Yet, paradoxically, this weakness gave space for remarkable cultural flourishing. The 14th and 15th centuries saw the flowering of Zen Buddhism as a cultural force. Zen gardens, with their carefully raked gravel and artfully placed rocks, were not just decoration, but meditations in stone. The tea ceremony evolved, turning the act of drinking powdered green tea into a ritual of simplicity and grace. Monochrome ink painting, with its stark landscapes of mountains and mists, captured a distinctly Japanese aesthetic, austere, subtle, serene. This was also the era of no theatre, with masked actors moving slowly, chanting, and accompanied by haunting flute and drum. To modern audiences, no can seem glacially slow, the sort of thing that makes opera look like an action film. But for its devotees it was profound, a merging of ritual, drama and philosophy. Yet, behind the cultural refinement, politics grew messy. The shogunate struggled to control the provinces. Regional lords, daimyo, became increasingly independent, building castles, raising armies, and ruling their territories like miniature kings. Trade with China, especially under the Ming dynasty, enriched some of these lords, further fueling their autonomy. By the mid-15th century, the cracks widened into chaos. In 1467, the Onin War erupted, triggered by a succession dispute, but fueled by the ambitions of rival lords. Kyoto was devastated. Palaces burned, temples looted, the capital reduced to rubble. The Ashikaga shogunate survived in name, but in reality Japan had fractured. For the next century, warlords would battle endlessly in the Sengoku period, the age of the warring states. But that, of course, is for the next chapter. For now, we leave the Ashikaga age in its paradox, a time of weak government and strong culture, of shoguns who commanded little and monks who shaped much, of samurai lords rising even as tea-masters composed rituals of tranquility. It was an age when Japan repelled the mightiest empire on earth with the help of a storm, only to succumb to storms of its own making. It began, as civil wars so often do, with something that hardly seemed worth the blood that would follow. In 1467, Kyoto was torn apart by a squabble over who should succeed the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Two rival heirs were backed by rival noble families, each of them convinced their man was the only sensible option. Armies were raised, banners unfurled, and soon the streets of Kyoto were filled not with poetry readings and temple bells, but with armed men hacking at each other. Temples burned, aristocrats fled, and the city, once the beating heart of courtly elegance, became a battlefield. The Onin War, as it came to be known, dragged on for a decade, reduced much of the capital to ashes, and left the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate in tatters. When the fighting ended, nothing was settled. The shogun still wore his title, but it was an empty one. Across the provinces, ambitious warlords shrugged off any pretense of obedience and began ruling as they pleased. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, had begun. And it would not end until a century and a half of chaos, ambition, and bloodshed had finally produced a new, unified Japan. The Japan of this era resembled a patchwork quilt torn into strips and stitched back together with mismatched thread. Dozens of daimyo carved out their territories, each jealously guarding borders and waging war on their neighbours whenever opportunity beckoned. Alliances shifted like sand in the tide. A sworn brother one year might be an enemy the next. Marriage alliances, betrayals, surprise attacks and backroom plots were the order of the day. For the ordinary farmer, life meant sowing rice one season and the next watching soldiers trample it flat in the name of their lord's ambition. New castles sprang up everywhere. In earlier centuries, castles had been modest hilltop forts, little more than timber stockades. Now, daimyo built towering fortresses with stone bases, high walls, and moats broad enough to make attackers sweat at the thought of crossing them. Castles like Azuchi and Osaka were not just military bases, they were statements. To enter their golden halls and gaze at the painted screens of tigers and pine trees was to be reminded that here, on this hill, power resided. Castles became both the symbols and instruments of this fractured age, housing courts, treasuries, armories and granaries under one roof of authority. And yet, this was not simply the age of samurai lords striding about with banners. The chaos opened space for others. The Ikko-Ikki, leagues of militant Buddhist monks and peasants, rose up against their samurai overlords, fortified their temples, and sometimes carved out semi-independent states of their own. In Kaga province, the Ikko-Ikki ruled for nearly a century, a kind of theocratic republic in the midst of samurai warlords. For a while it seemed possible that the balance of Japan might tilt not toward great daimyo, but toward farmers and monks who dared defy them. This was also the age when ninja entered the chronicles. In the mountain valleys of Iga and Koga, small clans developed a reputation for stealth, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. They were not magical shadow warriors of later films, but clever guerrillas, using the land and surprise to compensate for their lack of numbers. Lords hired them as scouts and spies, while enemies cursed their sudden ambushes and nighttime raids. It is telling that even centuries later, daimyo of this era were remembered not just for their armies, but for whether or not they had the wit to employ shinobi at the right moment. Into this world of turmoil strode one of history's most fascinating figures, Oda Nobunaga. Born in 1534 in Owari province, Nobunaga inherited a modest domain, but possessed an immodest ambition. He was brash, unpredictable, and utterly ruthless. His contemporaries often dismissed him as eccentric. He dressed informally when others wore silks, and he had a habit of laughing at rituals most men bowed solemnly through. Yet behind the quirks was a mind that saw possibilities others missed. Nobunaga embraced firearms at a time when many still considered them unmanly toys. He purchased arquebuses from Portuguese traders and drilled his troops in coordinated volleys. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he famously used thousands of musketeers behind wooden palisades to devastate the charging cavalry of the Takeda clan. It was a turning point, proof that even the most dashing samurai charge could be shattered by the rhythm of gunfire. But Nobunaga's ruthlessness was not limited to the battlefield. In 1571, he ordered the destruction of Mount Hiei, home to the powerful Tendai Buddhist monastery. His men torched temples and slaughtered monks, sparing neither women nor children. It was brutality even by Sengoku standards, but it broke one of the last great religious powers capable of challenging him. Nobunaga's message was clear. Nothing, not shogun, not temple, not tradition, would stand in his way. By the 1580s, Nobunaga controlled central Japan, his castle at Azuchi standing as a gleaming symbol of his dominance. Yet his story ended abruptly. In 1582, one of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned on him, surrounding him at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. Trapped and outnumbered, Nobunaga took his own life. His dream of unifying Japan seemed, for the moment, as though it might die with him. But history, like theatre, often finds an understudy ready to step on stage. Nobunaga's general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, seized the moment. If Nobunaga had been a ruthless innovator, Hideyoshi was a miracle of social mobility. Born in 1537 to a peasant foot soldier, he rose from obscurity to become one of Japan's greatest unifiers. With charm, cunning, and an instinct for survival, he won over Nobunaga's allies, defeated his enemies, and took up the mantle of national leadership. Hideyoshi was a man of contradictions, generous and cultured one moment, suspicious and cruel the next. He patronized the arts, sponsored lavish tea ceremonies under the great master Senno Rikyu, and built Osaka Castle, a fortress palace so grand it seemed to announce that Japan had finally found its ruler. Yet he was also paranoid about loyalty, demanding oaths of obedience from rivals, and ensuring no one grew too powerful. To lock in control, he enacted the Great Sword Hunt, confiscating weapons from peasants so that only samurai could bear arms. Society hardened into strict classes: warriors, farmers, artisans, merchants, a structure that would last well into the Tokugawa age. With Japan largely unified under his rule, Hideyoshi turned his eyes outward. In 1592, he launched invasions of Korea, hoping to march his armies all the way to Ming China. It was a grandiose vision, but one built on shaky foundations. The Korean campaigns proved disastrous. Fierce local resistance, Ming reinforcements, and logistical nightmares bled Japan's armies dry. By 1598, with Hideyoshi on his deathbed, the exhausted troops were ordered home. His dream of continental conquest ended as abruptly as it began. After Hideyoshi's death, the stage was left to his heir, a child too young to rule, and the inevitable power struggle followed. Into this moment stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu, a daimyo of great patience and strategic brilliance. While others rushed into conflicts, Ieyasu played the long game, quietly strengthening his base and waiting for rivals to exhaust themselves. His moment came in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara, where his forces clashed with a coalition of opponents in one of the largest battles in Japanese history. As fog lifted that morning, betrayal and shifting loyalties sealed the outcome. Ieyasu emerged victorious, the road to shogunate firmly his. With Sekigahara, the Sengoku era ended. For a century and a half, Japan had been torn apart by ambition, betrayal, and near-constant conflict. Now, under Tokugawa Ieyasu, the country would enter an age of peace that would last for more than 2 centuries. Castles would still loom over the countryside. Samurai would still polish their swords. But for the first time in generations, the land would breathe. And yet, the Sengoku period, for all its hardship, was not only about war. Culture, paradoxically, thrived amid the turmoil. The great painter Kano Eitoku decorated castle walls with golden screens of tigers and landscapes. The tea ceremony reached new refinement, its quiet rituals of boiling water and sipping tea offering a counterpoint to the chaos outside. Even as men killed each other in fields, they paused in chambers lit by candles to contemplate the shape of a teacup. Such is history's strange duality: blood on the sword, serenity in the tea bowl. When we look back now, the Sengoku age can feel like a violent interlude between two more stable orders. Yet, it forged the men and the structures that would define Japan for centuries. It was a crucible in which ambition met discipline, innovation met tradition, and out of which emerged the foundations of the Tokugawa shogunate. The warlords dreamed of glory. What they left, oddly enough, was peace. The Sengoku era had left Japan weary of war. A century and a half of castles, betrayals, and battlefields had drained both blood and patience. In 1600, the Battle of Sekigahara brought the curtain down on this chaos and raised a new actor to center stage: Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man whose genius was not reckless charge or brilliant maneuver, but the quieter art of waiting until everyone else had made mistakes. With his victory, Japan stepped into a very different age. In 1603, Ieyasu was appointed shogun. Thus began the Tokugawa shogunate, which would last more than 250 years, one of the longest periods of stability in world history. The Sengoku had been blood and thunder. The Tokugawa era was order, hierarchy, and the slow, steady rhythms of peace. Ieyasu's genius lay not in winning battles, but in preventing them. He knew samurai lords, daimyo, were ambitious creatures, so he devised systems to keep them on a short leash. Most famously, the Sankin Kotai system required daimyo to spend alternating years in the capital, Edo, today's Tokyo, leaving their families behind as hostages when they returned home. It was part political surveillance, part extortion scheme. After all, maintaining two lavish households was ruinously expensive. The result? Bankrupted lords, docile provinces, and a capital city that grew into one of the largest in the world. Edo swelled to a population of over 1 million, bustling with merchants, artisans, and administrators. Samurai, meanwhile, found themselves in an odd predicament. For centuries they had defined themselves as warriors. But with no wars left to fight, they became bureaucrats, teachers, and moral exemplars. Their swords remained the symbol of their status, but they spent more time poring over Confucian texts than drawing their blades. The myth of the samurai code, Bushido, hardened in these centuries, partly as nostalgia for an age of battle, partly as a moral justification for a class that now lived on stipends rather than plunder. The Tokugawa regime also restructured society into rigid classes, samurai at the top, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. At least that was the theory. In practice, merchants grew rich, while samurai often slipped into debt. It was a delicate hypocrisy, like insisting the clergy were holy while borrowing money from the bankers you officially despised. Religion and philosophy shifted too. Confucianism provided the ideological backbone of Tokugawa order, stressing hierarchy and duty. Buddhism remained important, though increasingly tied to the state. Every household was required to register with a Buddhist temple, partly as a census, partly to suppress Christianity. Because yes, the Jesuit missionaries who had impressed Nobunaga and Hideyoshi were far less welcome under the Tokugawa. Christianity was banned, its followers persecuted, and converts forced to trample on images of Christ, the infamous Fumie. Those who refused often faced execution. The most dramatic Christian rebellion came in the Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 to 1638, when peasants and Christian converts in Kyushu rose against oppressive taxation and religious persecution. The shogunate crushed them with overwhelming force, massacring tens of thousands. It was a brutal message. Christianity was incompatible with Tokugawa Japan. Following Shimabara, the regime embraced sakoku, the closed country policy. From the 1630s onwards, Japan severely restricted foreign contact. Trade was limited mainly to the Dutch and Chinese at Nagasaki's artificial island of Dejima, where awkward negotiations were conducted through interpreters. Portuguese and Spanish traders were expelled, and Japanese were forbidden to travel abroad. To outsiders, Japan became a land of mystery, a closed world glimpsed only through filtered reports. To the Japanese themselves, it was a period of self-reliance, stability, and cultural blossoming. And blossom it did. The long peace allowed the growth of what the Japanese called the ukiyo, the flotation world. This was the culture of Edo's entertainment districts, kabuki theatre, woodblock prints, tea houses and pleasure quarters. The samurai might have preached duty and restraint, but the townsfolk, especially merchants flush with cash, revelled in art, fashion and hedonism. Kabuki theatre emerged in the early 1600s, founded by a woman named Izumo no Okuni, whose flamboyant performances drew crowds. Soon banned for being too scandalous, it re-emerged as all-male theatre, with actors specializing in both male and female roles. Kabuki was colorful, dramatic, and wildly popular, the opposite of the austere no-plays of the past. Meanwhile, ukiyo-e, woodblock prints, flourished. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige depicted landscapes, courtesans, kabuki actors, and scenes of everyday life with vivid colors and flowing lines. These prints were cheap enough to be purchased by common townsfolk, making art accessible in a way that startled European visitors centuries later. Van Gogh would one day copy them obsessively, but in their own time they decorated the walls of Edo's tea houses and merchant homes. Literature thrived as well. Matsuo Basho, the great haiku poet, perfected the art of capturing fleeting moments. A frog jumping into an old pond, the sound of water rippling, a universe contained in 17 syllables. In an age of order and tranquility, poetry found beauty in smallness. Yet beneath this cultural vibrancy, cracks were appearing. The rigid social order often failed to reflect reality. Merchants, officially the lowest class, grew immensely wealthy through trade, while many samurai struggled to maintain their dignity on modest stipends. Economic strains led to periodic unrest. Peasant uprisings flared in times of famine, especially in the 18th century. Natural disasters, floods, earthquakes and crop failures reminded everyone that even in peace, life could be precarious. Still, for over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa regime endured. Its strength lay in its balance. Strict control at the top, but space for culture and commerce below. Japan was not entirely cut off from the world. Dutch studies, rangaku, brought in glimpses of Western science, medicine and astronomy. Samurai scholars dissected foreign texts, sometimes literally dissecting bodies in the name of anatomy, while still insisting Japan had no need for foreigners. It was a closed country, but with one eye half open. By the early 19th century, however, the outside world was knocking harder. Western powers, armed with industrial technology and an enthusiasm for gunboat diplomacy, wanted Japan opened to trade. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States steamed into Edo Bay with a squadron of black ships, bristling with cannon, and demanded Japan open its ports. The Tokugawa government, recognizing it could hardly fight ironclads with matchlocks, reluctantly signed treaties granting access. This humiliation, unequal treaties, foreign intrusion, and the exposure of Japan's technological lag shook the regime to its core. Samurai, who had once been bureaucrats, rediscovered their taste for action. Slogans like "Revere the Emperor," "Expel the barbarians," began to circulate. The Tokugawa shogunate, after 2.5 centuries of order, was on the verge of collapse. But collapse does not erase achievement. For over 250 years, Japan had known peace. Towns had grown, culture had flourished, and society had stabilized. The samurai may have lost their swords to rust, but they had gained poetry, philosophy, and the quiet dignity of administration. The Tokugawa era was one of seclusion, yes, but also one of profound creation. And as the black ships disappeared over the horizon, Japan stood at the threshold of something entirely new: modernity. The next act would be revolution. When Commodore Perry's black ships glided into Edo Bay in 1853, their smoke-belching engines and hulking iron hulls might as well have been dragons rising from the deep. To the Japanese, accustomed to wooden junks and polite coastal traders, these American vessels were a shock to the senses, and a brutal reminder that the world beyond their carefully closed borders had not been standing still. The Tokugawa shogunate, already creaking under its own contradictions, tried to manage the situation by signing treaties with Western powers. These unequal treaties opened ports, granted foreigners extraterritorial rights, and capped tariffs. A national humiliation. The slogan "Sono Joi," "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," spread like wildfire, though in practice expelling the barbarians was easier said than done when they came armed with cannons and industrial navies. As the 1860s wore on, Japan fractured once again. Pro-imperial forces, frustrated with Tokugawa weakness, rallied to restore power to the emperor, a figure who, for centuries, had been largely ceremonial. Samurai from the domains of Satsuma and Choshu, fiery and reform-minded, took the lead. Civil war broke out in 1868, the Boshin War, which saw modernized imperial troops clashing with Tokugawa loyalists. The most famous battle was at Toba Fushimi, where shogunate forces, demoralized and outgunned, collapsed. The shogun resigned, and after 2.5 centuries of rule, the Tokugawa were done. Into the vacuum stepped a young emperor, Meiji. Just 15 years old, draped in ceremonial robes far too heavy for his shoulders, he became the symbol of a new age. His reign name, Meiji, meant enlightened rule. And that was exactly what Japan's leaders intended: enlightenment, modernization, and a sprint into the future. The transformation was staggering. Within a generation, Japan leapt from feudal society to modern state. Samurai top-knots gave way to conscript armies in Western uniforms. Wooden castles were replaced by brick ministries. Rickshaws were joined by steam trains. In the space of a few decades, Japan went from isolation to empire, from rice paddies to factories. At the heart of this revolution was the abolition of the samurai class. In 1876, the government banned samurai from wearing swords in public, the very symbol of their identity. Many samurai, stripped of stipends and status, struggled to adapt. Some became teachers, bureaucrats, or businessmen. Others rebelled, none more famously than Saigo Takamori, once a hero of the Restoration, who turned against it in despair. His 1877 uprising, the Satsuma Rebellion, saw thousands of former samurai take up arms against the new conscript army. They fought bravely, but were crushed by modern rifles and artillery. Saigo died in battle, later romanticized as the last true samurai. His story inspired novels, films, and endless nostalgia. Not least because every society, when modernizing, likes to weep for the traditions it just abandoned. Meanwhile, the Meiji state set about remaking everything. The Charter Oath of 1868 promised deliberative assemblies and social mobility. In practice, power remained in the hands of a small oligarchy, the Meiji oligarchs, from Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Heisei domains, but the appearance of progress was important. Western institutions were copied with enthusiasm. A modern constitution, parliaments, courts, police, railways, postal systems, universities. Japan sent missions abroad to study the West, most famously the Iwakura mission, 1871 to 1873, in which statesmen and students toured Europe and America, peering curiously at factories, parliaments and railroads, before returning home to replicate them. Economically, the changes were breathtaking. New industries sprang up: silk factories, shipyards, rail networks. By the 1890s, Japan was exporting textiles, building steelworks, and boasting telegraph lines that blinked messages faster than any courier. Merchant families like the Mitsui and Mitsubishi grew into powerful zaibatsu conglomerates, the engines of industrial growth. Culturally, Japan went through what can only be called an identity crisis. Half frantic westernization, half stubborn Japaneseness. Men cut off their topknots. Women experimented with bustles and bonnets. Military officers strutted in Prussian-style uniforms. Bureaucrats scribbled notes in French leather-bound journals. Yet alongside the enthusiasm came unease. What, after all, did it mean to be Japanese in this new age? The slogan, "Japanese spirit, Western technique," tried to square the circle. Modernize the tools, preserve the soul. Education expanded dramatically. A national school system taught literacy, science, and patriotic devotion. Children who might once have spent their lives in rice paddies now sat at desks chanting lessons, their futures tied to the nation rather than the village. Newspapers proliferated, public debate widened, and the written word became central to a modernizing public sphere. And then there was the military. The Meiji leaders understood that survival depended on strength. They created a modern conscript army modelled on the Prussians and a navy inspired by the British Royal Navy. Within decades, Japan was no longer a victim of imperialism, but a budding imperial power itself. The proof came in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. Fought over influence in Korea, the war pitted Japan against Qing China, the traditional great power of East Asia. To the astonishment of the world, Japan triumphed. Modern rifles, disciplined troops and efficient ships overwhelmed the Qing forces. Japan gained Taiwan, control of Korea, and new prestige. The message was clear. Japan had joined the club of modern empires. Not long after, Japan turned on another newcomer, Russia. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, was even more astonishing. At Port Arthur, Mukden, and Tsushima, Japanese forces humbled one of Europe's great powers. When Admiral Togo Heihachiro destroyed the Russian fleet at Tsushima, news reverberated across Asia and Africa. Here was proof that an Asian nation, long patronized by the West, could beat a European empire at its own game. For many colonized peoples, it was a beacon of hope. For Japan, it was vindication. Of course, victory came with costs. Empire was expensive. Taxes were heavy. Rural Japan often lagged behind the glitter of Tokyo, with peasants enduring hardship while cities modernized. Industrial workers labored in grim factories, women especially, their lives far from the patriotic propaganda of progress. And politics, though dressed in constitutional forms, remained tightly controlled by the oligarchs and the emperor's divine authority. Yet, the transformation was undeniable. In 1868, Japan was a feudal archipelago nervously watching foreign ships. By 1912, at the death of Emperor Meiji, it was an industrial power with an empire, a modern army, and a global reputation. The change had been dizzying, unsettling, and at times brutal, but it had worked. As the Meiji era ended, Japan stood taller than ever, proud, ambitious, and restless. The old world of samurai had vanished, replaced by one of steam engines, factories, and parliaments. But beneath the new Western suits and constitutional preambles, the Japanese spirit endured, disciplined, adaptive, and determined never again to be at the mercy of outsiders. The death of Emperor Meiji in 1912 was more than the passing of a monarch. It was the curtain call on an age of astonishing transformation. In just 45 years, Japan had gone from rice paddies and samurai to railways, rifles, and empire. The man who had presided over this sprint into modernity left behind a nation that was proud, ambitious, and perhaps a little intoxicated with its own success. His successor, the frail Emperor Taisho, inherited both the throne and a puzzle. What should Japan do next? The Taisho era, 1912 to 1926, has often been dubbed Japan's age of democracy, though the word, as always, needs a pinch of salt. Taisho himself was sickly and often incapable of active rule. This left space for political parties and elected leaders to take centre stage. Cabinets were formed by party politicians. Universal male suffrage arrived in 1925, and newspapers were full of chatter about parliaments and policies. For a while, Tokyo looked positively modern, a miniature Westminster with a taste for sake instead of sherry. The capital itself had a lively buzz. Jazz cafes thrummed with imported tunes. Department stores sparkled with Western fashions, and intellectuals argued in smoky bars about Marxism, anarchism, and women's rights. A stroll through the Ginza might bring you face to face with a flapper in a cloche hat, a radical student waving a pamphlet, and a bewildered ex-samurai now working as a minor civil servant. But beneath the glamour, cracks widened. In 1923, the great Kanto earthquake flattened Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 100,000 people. Amid the rubble, rumours of Korean saboteurs spread, sparking pogroms and massacres of innocent migrants. It was a chilling reminder that modernity could collapse into medieval violence with terrifying speed. Then came the Great Depression. Silk exports, the lifeblood of the economy, collapsed. Rural villages starved. Desperate families sold daughters into servitude, and urban workers rioted. Politicians, already mistrusted, looked hapless. The dream of democracy soured quickly. Into this disillusion stepped the one institution that had never really bowed to civilian authority, the military. The 1930s in Japan were an age of uniforms, coups, and assassinations. Young officers, convinced that only they could restore national greatness, gunned down ministers and staged attempted takeovers. Newspapers, instead of condemning them, often applauded. Party democracy withered under bayonet points. The tipping point came in 1931. After a staged railway explosion, the Mukden incident, Japanese troops invaded Manchuria, carving out a puppet state called Manchukuo under the last Qing emperor Puyi. Civilian leaders in Tokyo protested, but the army shrugged and marched on. The international community condemned the move, but Japan responded by quitting the League of Nations in 1933. It was a declaration. Japan would chart its own course, regardless of lectures from Geneva. 4 years later, escalation became all-out war. In 1937, clashes near Beijing spiraled into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces surged into northern and eastern China, capturing Shanghai in brutal fighting, and then moving on to the capital, Nanjing. And here the story darkens to one of its blackest chapters, the Nanjing Massacre. When Japanese troops entered the city in December 1937, discipline collapsed. For 6 weeks, soldiers unleashed terror on a staggering scale. Historians estimate between 200,000 and 300,000 people were killed. Captured Chinese soldiers were rounded up and executed in their thousands, marched to riverbanks and machine-gunned into the water, bayoneted in contests as if human lives were sporting scores. Civilians fared little better. Men dragged from their homes, fathers shot in front of their families, whole households extinguished. Women endured unspeakable suffering. Tens of thousands were raped, schoolgirls, mothers, grandmothers. Many were then killed to cover the crime. Survivors recalled hiding for weeks beneath floorboards, listening to screams outside, scarcely daring to breathe. And yet, amid the horror, fragments of humanity flickered. A handful of foreigners created the Nanjing Safety Zone, protecting around 200,000 civilians. Among them was John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi party member whose swastika armband, ironically, deterred some Japanese soldiers. His diaries, written in desperate detail, remain among the most haunting accounts of atrocity in the 20th century. The Nanjing Massacre was no battlefield accident. It was a collapse into cruelty, a moral chasm whose memory still scars East Asia. From that moment onward, Japan's war in China was no longer simply a war between armies. It was a war against civilians, fought with bombs, bayonets, and starvation. Meanwhile, back home, ideology hardened. Schools drilled children in emperor worship, newspapers trumpeted self-sacrifice, and dissenters were silenced. The state became a machine for total mobilization, with Emperor Hirohito enthroned in 1926 as the divine figurehead of this destiny. His exact role remains debated, but to his subjects he was the voice of heaven, beyond question, beyond doubt. By the late 1930s, Japan's leaders were convinced of two things: that resources were essential, and that only expansion could secure them. When Europe collapsed into war in 1939, Japan seized opportunities, occupying French Indochina in 1940 and joining Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. But this brought confrontation with the United States and Britain. Western embargoes on oil and steel threatened to strangle Japan's empire. The militarist solution? Strike first, and strike hard. Thus came 7th December 1941. Japanese carrier planes swooped over Pearl Harbor, sinking battleships and igniting fuel depots. For a brief moment, Japan seemed unstoppable. Its armies swept through Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, capturing a vast swathe of Asia. Propaganda hailed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a grand phrase meaning, in practice, empire under Japanese control. But the triumph was short-lived. At Midway in 1942, American aircraft sank 4 Japanese carriers, a catastrophe from which the Imperial Navy never recovered. Slowly but relentlessly, the Allies pushed back across the Pacific. Battles at Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf and Okinawa left oceans littered with wrecks and skies filled with smoke. American submarines strangled Japan's supply lines. By 1944, Japan's cities were burning under waves of incendiary bombs. Tokyo itself was reduced to ashes in a single night of firebombing, with 100,000 dead. Desperation bred extremity. Kamikaze pilots, named after the divine wind that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion, now flung themselves into Allied ships. They burned with patriotic fervour, but the strategy was one of despair. A nation sacrificing its youth because it had run out of options. Then came August 1945. On the 6th of August, a single B-29 bomber flew over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released a bomb called Little Boy. In a split second, a blinding flash consumed the city centre. Tens of thousands died instantly. Others staggered through ruins, skin burned, clothing shredded. Water desperately sought but useless against radiation. A city of 300,000 was reduced to ash and silence. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. The blast tore through valleys and hillsides, flattening houses, killing tens of thousands more. Survivors, the hibakusha, bore scars, cancers, and memories that would shape Japan's conscience for generations. The bombs were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Firebombs had destroyed Tokyo, yes, but this was different. One plane, one bomb, one city gone. It was terror condensed into a moment, the dawn of the nuclear age. At last, the emperor intervened. On the 15th of August 1945, his voice crackled through radios across the country, the first time his subjects had ever heard him. In archaic, formal language, he told them the war must end, that they must endure the unendurable. For millions listening in ruined homes, the message was clear. Japan had surrendered. The cost was unfathomable. Millions dead across Asia, Japanese cities reduced to rubble, empire dissolved. What had begun with visions of liberation and glory ended in ruin and ashes. Yet, amid the devastation, seeds of a new Japan would soon sprout. Democracy, recovery, and an economic miracle. But that belongs to the next chapter. When the Emperor's voice finally crackled across the radio waves in August 1945, Japan stood on the edge of ruin. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Fields lay untilled. Industry shattered. And millions of people displaced. To listen to Hirohito's strange, formal diction speaking of enduring the unendurable was to hear the sound of an old world crumbling. For centuries, the Japanese had been told their emperor was divine, untouchable, almost beyond the mortal realm. Now, he was a man on the radio telling them they had lost. Into this ruin stepped an unlikely figure, General Douglas MacArthur, pipe clenched between his teeth, sunglasses flashing. When he first arrived to oversee the Allied occupation, many expected harshness, perhaps a dismantling of Japan altogether. Instead, MacArthur played the role of benevolent overseer. He ruled from his Tokyo headquarters as a kind of American shogun, issuing orders with the confidence of a man convinced Providence had placed him here to remake a nation. And, oddly enough, he did. Under occupation, Japan was transformed. The old imperial army was dismantled, its swords and rifles stacked and melted down. War criminals were put on trial in Tokyo, some condemned, others quietly spared for Cold War convenience. Land reform broke the power of the great landlords, redistributing fields to peasants who had long worked them. Women were granted the vote, an astonishing change in a society that only a decade earlier had demanded obedience from daughters and wives. A new constitution was drafted in 1947, its most famous clause renouncing war altogether. Article 9 declared Japan would never again maintain military forces for aggression, though in practice the self-defense forces would emerge soon enough, a lawyerly twist that MacArthur might have raised his pipe at approvingly. The emperor, stripped of divinity, remained on the throne as a symbol. It was a shrewd decision. To depose Hirohito might have broken the fragile post-war order. To keep him, rebranded as a gentle figurehead, gave continuity. From then on, he was less the living god of wartime propaganda, and more a somewhat awkward monarch waving politely at parades. But if the politics of occupation reshaped Japan's institutions, the daily reality was harder. Hunger stalked the land. In 1946, food shortages meant many survived on millet and sweet potatoes. Black markets flourished, with American cigarettes and chocolate becoming the currency of choice. The winter of 1945–46 was bitter, and it is no exaggeration to say that, without American aid, millions might have starved. Yet somehow, amid the rubble, people began to rebuild. Small factories reopened. Children returned to schools, often held in half-burned classrooms. Life, stubbornly, went on. By the early 1950s, the winds of the Cold War changed everything. Washington, once determined to demilitarize and democratize Japan, now saw it as a vital bulwark against communism in Asia. With Mao's China to the west and the Korean War raging nearby, the Americans hurried Japan back onto its feet. In 1951, the occupation formally ended with the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. By 1952, sovereignty was restored, though U.S. bases remained, their aircraft thundering over Japanese skies in a reminder of who truly guaranteed security. Then came the miracle. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japan's economy took off with such speed that the world could hardly believe it. From the ashes of defeat, factories roared back to life. Companies like Sony, Toyota, and Honda became symbols of a new Japan, lean, efficient, innovative. The bullet train, the Shinkansen, debuted in 1964, whisking passengers at unheard-of speeds between Tokyo and Osaka. It was sleek, modern, and symbolized Japan's rebirth as a nation no longer defined by bombs, but by engineering brilliance. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics cemented this new image. Where once the world had seen Japan as a defeated aggressor, now it saw a nation of neon lights, orderly crowds, and high-tech wonders. For Japanese citizens who remembered the ruins of 1945, to watch athletes march into a shining Olympic stadium was nothing short of astonishing. And yet, behind the glitter of the economic miracle, life was not always easy. Factory workers labored long hours, company loyalty binding them like modern samurai to corporate lords. The salaryman became the archetype of post-war Japan, neat suit, briefcase, and the weary shuffle toward the last train home. Women, though newly enfranchised, often found themselves back in traditional roles, juggling family duties with limited opportunities in the workplace. Prosperity had come, but it demanded sacrifice. Politics, too, grew stable but somewhat dull. The Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, dominated government for decades, a one-party system in all but name. Corruption scandals bubbled up occasionally, but stability was prized above drama. For a people who had endured the turbulence of the early 20th century, a little political monotony was almost a relief. Culturally, Japan was resurgent. Manga and anime flourished in the post-war decades, carrying Japanese stories and art far beyond the islands. Kurosawa's films captivated global audiences, blending samurai tales with Smith's Shakespearean grandeur. By the 1980s, Japanese pop culture, from video games to cartoons, was flowing overseas as quickly as Toyotas and Walkmans. A new kind of empire was being built, not through conquests, but through culture and commerce. The economic boom of the 1970s and 1980s reached almost surreal heights. Land in Tokyo became so valuable that famously the grounds of the Imperial Palace were said to be worth more than all the real estate in California. Japanese companies bought skyscrapers in New York, golf courses in Hawaii, even Hollywood studios. Newspapers fretted that Japan was poised to buy the world. In truth, the bubble was swelling, and bubbles, as history teaches, always burst. But in the 1980s, it felt as though the rising sun shone brightest of all. And so Japan travelled from ruin to riches in barely 4 decades. From scorched cities and starving civilians, it had become the second largest economy in the world, its cars and electronics filling homes from Buenos Aires to Berlin. The trauma of war had not been forgotten, but it had been channeled into a determination to succeed in peace. The samurai ethic of discipline and loyalty had been repurposed into the boardroom and the factory floor. The warrior spirit had traded armour for a necktie, but the intensity remained. Looking back, one cannot help but marvel at the speed of the transformation. Occupation, reform, hunger, recovery, prosperity. It was a story almost too swift, too neat, and yet entirely true. Japan had endured the unendurable, as the emperor had said, and then gone on to achieve the unimaginable. And, in the neon glow of Shinjuku and the rush of the bullet train, one could glimpse not only a reborn nation, but a society that had taken the ashes of defeat and built from them the scaffolding of a miracle. By the end of the 1980s, Japan seemed unstoppable. Its companies owned golf courses in Hawaii. Its banks lent money to half the globe, and land in Tokyo was so absurdly expensive that people joked the imperial palace grounds were worth more than California. It felt as though the rising sun was blazing brighter than ever, an unstoppable economic titan that had somehow leapt from ruin to riches in less than 2 generations. And then, as bubbles always do, it burst. The 1990s began with the collapse of Japan's property and stock market bubble, an implosion so severe that the entire decade, some say 2 decades, came to be known as the lost years. The Nikkei stock index plunged, land values shrank, banks found themselves with mountains of bad debt, and suddenly the miracle economy looked not so miraculous. For ordinary Japanese, it meant stagnating wages, dwindling job security, and a creeping sense that the golden age of endless growth had passed. Salarymen still trudged to work, but now with a little less bounce in their step. The Heisei era, named for the reign of Emperor Akihito, who ascended in 1989, became an age of adjustment. Politicians tinkered with reforms. Banks shuffled their balance sheets. But the dynamism of the post-war boom was gone. Instead, Japan became the world's cautionary tale. Proof that even the mightiest economy could stall. And yet, life carried on, in that peculiarly Japanese way, with a quiet dignity, a stoic acceptance, and the occasional wry joke about how yesterday's tycoons were now selling discount sushi. Culture, however, did not stagnate. If the economy slowed, Japanese pop culture sped up, roaring onto the world stage with astonishing force. The 1990s and 2000s saw anime and manga spread far beyond Japan's shores. Characters like Pikachu, Sailor Moon, and Dragon Ball's Goku became global icons. Video game companies like Nintendo, Sega, and Sony conquered living rooms across continents. While the factories no longer dazzled the world as they once had, the imagination of Japan reached into every corner of global youth culture. A boy with a Game Boy in Buenos Aires, or a girl with a manga in Paris, was part of Japan's new empire, an empire of stories and pixels rather than soldiers. Yet, Alongside this cultural flowering came sobering realities. Natural disasters tested the nation's resilience. The Great Hanshin earthquake of 1995 devastated Kobe, killing over 6,000 people and leaving tens of thousands homeless. Television images of highways collapsed like toy tracks, and fires raging through wooden houses reminded the world how fragile modern life remained. In 2011, far worse struck. The Great East Japan earthquake, followed by a tsunami that swallowed whole towns, killed nearly 20,000 people and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Images of black waves sweeping across rice fields, cars bobbing like toys, and reactors venting steam are seared into memory. Yet again, Japanese resilience was on display. Communities rebuilding, neighbours helping neighbours, and volunteers streaming in to aid. The scars remain, but so too does the strength of endurance. Politically, the Heisei era brought its own shifts. For decades, the Liberal Democratic Party had governed Japan with an iron grip, disguised as gentle paternalism. But in 1993, it briefly lost power, only to return. Prime ministers came and went at an almost dizzying rate, until one man managed to linger: Shinzo Abe, who served longer than any other in Japanese history. Abe championed Abenomics, an attempt to drag Japan out of stagnation with bold fiscal policies. Whether it truly worked is still debated, but his presence steadied politics in a way not seen since the 1950s. His later assassination in 2022 shocked the nation, a reminder of fragility even in an era of peace. Socially, Japan faced profound challenges. An aging population with one of the lowest birth rates in the world meant fewer workers and more elderly citizens needing care. Villages emptied as young people moved to cities, leaving behind ghost towns of shuttered schools and abandoned houses. Robots and AI were proposed as partial solutions, because if any nation could imagine mechanical carers for the elderly, it was surely Japan. Yet, beneath the innovation lay a quiet anxiety. How to sustain a society when more diapers are sold for pensioners than for babies? Still, amid the grey clouds of stagnation and demographic worry, modern Japan found moments of joy and pride. The 2002 FIFA World Cup, co-hosted with South Korea, filled stadiums with colour and celebration. The Tokyo 2020 Olympics, delayed by a pandemic and held under restrictions, still managed to showcase Japanese efficiency and elegance. And in 2019, a new era dawned as Emperor Akihito abdicated, the first Japanese monarch to do so in 2 centuries, and his son Naruhito ascended the throne, marking the start of the Reiwa era. His reign, named for beautiful harmony, began in uncertain times, with the COVID-19 pandemic sweeping across the world, testing Japan as it tested everywhere. The Japan of the present day is a nation of paradoxes. It is high-tech, yet nostalgic, proud of ancient shrines, yet obsessed with convenience stores that sell everything from hot coffee to clean socks at 2 a.m. It is global, sending anime and automobiles across oceans, and yet deeply local, with neighbourhood festivals, cherry blossom viewing, and the patient art of bowing still at its heart. It is a country that has known both ruin and miracle, stagnation and creativity, sorrow, and resilience. As the Heisei gave way to Reiwa, Japan entered the 21st century not as the unstoppable giant once feared in the 1980s, but as something perhaps more enduring. A steady, thoughtful society, cautious of the future, yet quietly confident it could endure whatever storms might come. After all, endurance has always been Japan's greatest art. And so, from the Jōmon hunters fashioning clay figurines in ancient forests, to the neon glow of Shinjuku, we have wandered across Japan's story. It is a tale of islands that somehow always seemed to balance isolation with openness, of warriors and poets, monks and merchants, emperors divine and emperors dethroned, of ruin and miracle, collapse and renewal. Few nations have swung between such extremes and yet maintained such an unbroken sense of self. The Japan of legend is always a country of paradoxes. It is the land of cherry blossoms, fragile and fleeting, yet also the land of iron discipline, where a samurai would bow to death without complaint. It is the land of minimalist gardens and Zen meditation, yet also the land of Osaka's neon, pachinko parlors, and pop idols. It is a place that will sit quietly in a tea room, contemplating the shape of a teacup, then unleash an economic miracle that leaves Wall Street blinking in surprise. It is a society that reveres tradition yet endlessly reinvents itself, where women in kimono still walk past teenagers in manga-inspired costumes, and neither looks especially out of place. Looking back across the centuries, one theme emerges again and again: endurance. The Mongols were repelled, the Sengoku chaos endured, the bombs fell, and the bubble burst. But Japan went on. Each catastrophe was followed not only by survival, but by reinvention. Perhaps no people have turned disaster into determination so consistently. The ashes of 1945 gave rise to bullet trains. The ruins of Kobe and Fukushima became rebuilt communities. And even in the face of demographic decline, there is a quiet confidence that somehow the story will continue. There is also a pattern of synthesis. Japan has always been eager to borrow, adapt, and transform. Buddhism from China became Zen. Firearms from Portugal became tools of samurai armies. Baseball from America became a national passion. Anime and video games, born in post-war studios, went on to capture the world. Rarely has a culture been so adept at absorbing the foreign and making it unmistakably its own. And yet, through all the centuries, something distinctly Japanese persisted. A sensibility that values harmony, resilience, and the beauty of impermanence. The Heian courtiers who composed poems about autumn leaves would, I think, recognize something of themselves in the crowds who gather each spring to admire cherry blossoms. The samurai who polished their swords with ritual care would not be entirely bewildered by the engineers who polish the bullet train's nose cone until it gleams. And the emperors, who once ruled as divine sovereigns, might even nod in quiet recognition at their descendants, reduced now to ceremonial figureheads, but still symbols of continuity in a land that has seen everything from feudal battles to nuclear devastation. To tell Japan's story is to tell of contradictions, a warrior culture that produced exquisite art, a pacifist constitution in the land of kamikaze, An aging society at the cutting edge of robotics. But perhaps that is why it fascinates. Japan has never been one thing. It has been many things at once. And in those tensions lies its strength. As we close this long wander through Japanese history, one question remains, soft and lingering. What, in the end, is Japan's greatest legacy? Is it the sword of the samurai gleaming in ritual polish? Is it the haiku, 3 short lines capturing the universe in 17 syllables? Is it the economic miracle that turned rubble into neon skylines? Or is it something simpler? The art of enduring, of remaking, of always finding a way to carry on, whatever the world throws at it. It is a question best left unanswered, perhaps, as you drift off to sleep. For in the quiet of the night, the story of Japan is still unfolding. And tomorrow, like the cherry blossoms, it may look a little different, yet still, recognizably, the same.